insulin pharmacodynamics, established the so-called glucose clamp technology in our department. This was my main area of interest for a number of years. We built a whole company called Profile, which was very much focused, especially in the early years, on insulin pharmacology. And it's somewhat the same idea. And like in neurophysiology and then in metabolic research, you apply a certain stimulus, in this case, insulin injection, and see, okay, what happens to blood glucose levels in the time thereafter. And if you then counterbalance the metabolic effect of the applied insulin by an intravenous glucose infusion and then plot the glucose infusion rates over time, it gives you a good understanding of the metabolic effect of the applied insulin. And the interesting point was that it's not only in insulin per se, we had also performed studies and with inhaled insulin, with
Welcome to Global Diabetes Insights, your go-to podcast for navigating the world of diabetes. I am Tino, a certified diabetes educator and a global advocate for non-communicable diseases.
And I'm Kona, a global advocate and a medical doctor. Together, we're your hosts, dedicated to raising awareness, fostering open discussions, and creating a safe space for everyone affected by diabetes.
Join us as we dive into empowering conversations with individuals living with diabetes, caregivers, healthcare professionals, and researchers. Our goal is to not only guide you through effective diabetes management, but also to inspire advocacy for proper healthcare access.
So get ready for a journey of insights, ideas, and diverse perspectives. Let's amplify our collective voice and create positive change. Get involved, get engaged, and join us in creating the change we need. So welcome everybody to Global Diabetes Insights. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Global Diabetes Insight podcast. Today we have Dr. Lutz with us. First of all, I would like to thank you for being here in this podcast. Then I will ask you to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here in this podcast. My name is Lutz Heinmann. As you can hear from my German English, I'm German. However, I also live in the US for a good part of the year, so I'm going back and forth. By training, I'm not a physician. I'm a scientist and engineer working now in the diabetes area for more than 30 years, and I have certain interests and topics, but probably something to talk about a little bit later more.
Yeah, you already mentioned it, that you're an engineer and also into biology and into diabetes research and in the diabetes field generally. So what led you to the diabetes field from a scientific point of view?
Usual in life, there are many factors that driving you. It's not always a smart decision or a rational background. When I ended my study of biology, I worked in a neurophysiology department, and one of my colleagues who was trained as a physician, we cooperated quite nicely, and he then started to work in the diabetes area and asked me, Lutz, are you interested in helping us? We have some interesting project, insulin pharmacology. Probably this is a topic for you that you, with your technology background and understanding of physiology, might be interested to work with us on. That's how I was motivated to start in the diabetes field. It's obvious from my background, I had no previous exposure to diabetes, but then after a while I fell in love with this area of research, and here I am some decades later.
Again, you mentioned it that you started in neurophysiology and then transitioned it into internal medicine. Internal medicine for me is like a magic world. You get to see what really happens in your body. If you start studying internal medicine, it's reading a story, like you want to see what's happening next. How do you experience that transition? Neurophysiology is totally different to internal medicine.
Yes and no. When I start thinking about it a little bit with neurophysiology, you're also interested to see how do things communicate with each other, how do systems react to a certain stimulus and so on. So when I started in diabetes research, my focus was clearly on insulin pharmacodynamics, established the so-called glucose clamp technology in our department. This was my main area of interest for a number of years. We built a whole company called Profile, which was very much focused, especially in the early years, on insulin pharmacology. And it's somewhat the same idea. And like in neurophysiology and then in metabolic research, you apply a certain stimulus, in this case, insulin injection, and see, okay, what happens to blood glucose levels in the time thereafter. And if you then counterbalance the metabolic effect of the applied insulin by an intravenous glucose infusion and then plot the glucose infusion rates over time, it gives you a good understanding of the metabolic effect of the applied insulin. And the interesting point was that it's not only in insulin per se. We had also performed studies then with inhaled insulin, with transdermal insulin, and so on. The whole physiology of insulin pharmacology was also quite of interest for me.
If you were asked to describe the greatest finding in this area, what would it be in insulin pharmacology?
When I started with the glucose clamp technology, there were only human insulin formulations, some pig and other animal insulins around. However, then the first insulin analogs show up. This was somewhat a crazy idea at this point in time, something we regard as standard today, something very innovative. What is this? What's going on there with insulin analogs? So, and I think a lot of my early research was about rapid acting and then later on long acting insulin analogs. That we have such good basal insulins, for example, now that cover the baseline requirements during the night or between meals. This was something new. I think for many patients, the idea of having NPH insulin or so, depending on where you are on the planet, is somewhat nothing they are familiar with. But as I tried to indicate, in these days, this was innovative research, and I was in the forefront of it by chance. I had a chance to publish a number of the early studies about the pharmacodynamic properties of insulin analogs, one of the important contributions of my research.
I know that you're also involved in diabetes technology. I would like you to mention what you think is the greatest advantage that we have as type 1 or type 2 diabetic, one of your contributions in this field.
So when I started in the diabetes area, former boss Michael Berger was a very innovative, really a creative guy. However, he was convinced that for most patients, usage of test strips for blood glucose measurement would be more than enough information and so on. And then when I started in his department, again, with my technology background, the first companies show up and say, we have the idea of continuous glucose monitoring, which was, again, okay, will not work, it's too challenging and so on. Something we regard as standard today, at least for patients with type 1 diabetes. And I was involved in a number, well, still today, I'm involved in a number of developments for continuous glucose monitoring, later than the usage of the CGM systems in combination with the algorithm insulin pumps in a system for automatic insulin delivery. CGM was something I was very much involved in the early project, understanding what is needed there in kinds of algorithms and so on. So CGM is one of my other main interests in research.
I always say that people who help with diabetes technology are not lucky enough to experience the difference between our life before the new technology and after. I mean, if you don't have type 1 diabetes, you can't experience this happiness and this freedom that has provided by these advantages. We are always thankful to people who want to contribute to make our lives better and easier. I know that you started from engineering and you're also an entrepreneur in the Profil Institute for Metabolic Research. You have many roles in your professional life.
Comes with age.
How do you manage this, and do they complete each other or are they totally independent?
I would say both. In other words, we started this research institute in Neuss, Germany here some 25 years ago. And the idea was that we wanted to do the research, the glucose clamp studies that I mentioned before, in a more professional way. In other words, in an academic surrounding, it's somewhat difficult to build up a unit. Probably it's easier today, but 25 years ago, it was tricky. They can hire people, they can build rooms in the way you need them to perform studies adequately and so on. And we had then the idea, my colleague Tim Hires, we say, okay, let's try to find a way how we can perform clinical trials in a professional, academic, scientific manner with the ideas and the principles of industrial performing clinical trials in a kind of a third way. This is what has driven our early years of building up the Profile Institute. We have more than 250 employees now running a lot of early phase clinical trials in a highly professional manner. And I think this is really something also somewhat proud of, how we were able to really push forward the development of a number of new therapeutic principles, also of technology, by the work we have done in this institute. We were not always nice to the certain developments in that sense that sometimes the people didn't like the negative results that show up in a number of the studies. However, my old boss always said, go to the most critical guy. You can hear him with my scientific background. I have a tendency to be critical and skeptical about things. However, if you think about what the patients have to use it at the end, then you should be critical and careful, not negative. That's not what I'm saying, but you should go for the best option to do something. It has a lot of learnings about other aspects, managing a company, technical things, having employees and so on, a different world, many aspects that have not too much to do with science anymore.
Coming again to science and research, you're a managing editor in Journal of Diabetes Sciences. What impact have you made throughout your journey with it?
First, I have to acknowledge that I stopped working as the managing editor of the GDST some weeks ago. After 13 years, I thought enough is enough. Main reason is that I turned 70 some months ago, and I had the impression more young people like you should become more leaders of the research, that people like you who have grown up with apps, digital world, that you are the future, not me anymore. I tried, you might have heard already in my other comments, I tried to push ahead the development of GDST, of this scientific journal, a lot by the way I approach topic in a critical but constructive manner. I counted how many abstracts, how many manuscripts I had to look at in the 13 years in my role as managing editor, more than 3,000. In other words, I spent weeks, months probably in front of my computer reading manuscripts, trying to understand what the innovative idea presented in this manuscript, reading the reviews of colleagues that had a critical look on the manuscripts, and then make decisions about the acceptance of the manuscript or not. There's a lot of influence you have as the editor of a journal. I would not say that there is one thing you can do as an editor, but if you have a positive impetus, I think this comes across, and my understanding and the reflection when I stopped my work were quite nice by many colleagues that appreciated the work, the brain that I tried to bring to the table to push the development ahead, and this is something people have acknowledged, and I'm happy about this. But as I tried to indicate, enough is enough at a point in time.
I want to highlight the courage to pass the torch to younger people, because many older researchers, doctors in this field feel like they have the authority to be always right and to not listen to new ideas from younger people who don't have the experience, but they're in the process of learning, want to make some steps forward. And I really appreciate this point of view, because I think in the scientific community, this is important, because what we do is for people.
So when people ask me, why are you doing it, Lutz? Why are you stepping back? I said, age is one topic, but the other one is clearly, when I was young, I complained about the older colleagues who are not going out of the way, who are blocking developments and so on. And I have these statements, my own statements in mind, and clearly I have to apply this to myself. But I agree, some of our colleagues have a tendency to always believe I'm the only one who can bring development forward and so on, but that's not my piece of cake.
And also, you experience diabetes from two different points of view, from the European point of view and also the American point of view. How is that? Because I've been to some conferences with people from other countries in Europe with diabetes, and even from country to country, it differs. But when it comes to continents, I think there are huge differences when it comes to management, to access, to technology, everything, to approaches.
Yeah, good points that you're raising here. Living in both worlds, European world and the US world, give you some interesting insights into differences. So let me talk about one of the topics that is close to my heart. This is green diabetes. In other words, my colleague David Glonoff, I remember we worked at the journal for many years together. He's still with the journal. I am also still with the journal, but not as editor anymore. We developed the idea of having a green diabetes initiative some years ago, and we are following on this. We have published a number of articles about it, also some kind of declaration what to do and so on. Please acknowledge that with each CGM glucose sensor that you apply to you, you throw away an inserter, which is very nice, convenient, and so on. But this little plastic piece means 70 grams of plastic that are going to the waste. Like this, you have a lot of infusion set, pump material, and so on and so on. A lot of good ideas, good products, don't get me wrong. Some have all the light there, has also a shade. In other words, you have a lot of waste generated by modern diabetes technology, modern diabetes therapy. I think we have to think about the climate change, all these aspects. We have to think about these things and handle. Living in Europe and then the US, coming back to the topic, it's interesting that at least in Germany and in many European countries, the interest in being sensitive to environmental changes, sustainability, and so on is more pronounced than in the US. I actually live in California, which might not be the US. People are there also more sensitive to environmental aspects and so on. Nevertheless, if you talk to the colleagues, you realize, in that sense, we are a little bit more advanced in Europe. The US colleagues are following us, but a little bit slower. But this is only one example that I would like to make where I see differences in the approach. Another difference, again, things have changed recently more, is the empowerment of patients with diabetes. When the department I'm coming from, Michael Berger, the empowerment of patients was one of his main topics. Teaching and training programs for patients, making the patients themselves as their best therapists. I think this is something we early on pushed ahead in Germany, in Europe. And it took the US quite a while to have this change in mindset that gives a lot more of the role of taking care of your disease to the patient and not to the treating physician. However, I don't want to sound arrogant. There are many other aspects that are better in the US or where the US are more advanced, digitalization, for example, where we as Europeans can learn from it. So I see pros and cons in both worlds, and probably I'm somewhat a messenger of information, of new ideas into both worlds.
I like the part about patient engagement and empowerment, because we tend to forget that people with diabetes are living expertise and they don't have the scientific background, but they have a huge experience and they know their body and diabetes better than everyone else. I say that there is one diabetes by definition, but there are many people with diabetes, and that makes diabetes having so many different phases and different approaches for each body, for each organism. And people with diabetes live with a condition that influences their life. They should be educated enough and trained enough to deal with it almost without the need of a doctor.
Yeah, and I think the modern technology is helping patients to do exactly what you just described much better than it was possible 10, 20, 30 years ago. So now having the current glucose values shown by the CGM system all the time is of help. That you have alarms that help you to realize, there's a hypoglycemic event probably coming along, but I then can have a glucagon application where I can have the system in my hand all the time and so on. So technology and the therapeutic options that are available are today much better than 20, 30 years ago. And patients have many more degrees of freedom. If you talk to elderly patients, they describe what kind of needles they had to use in former times, how much pain was associated with insulin administration or painful blood glucose monitoring boards and so on. Some of these stories are sounding weird or strange to young patients. They are not used use it. They cannot imagine that you have to prick your fingers 3, 4, 5 times a day and so on. CGM systems there all the time, which is good, don't get me wrong, but I think it's interesting to see how much the therapy has changed, and probably it will continue to change. The progress has not slowed down, from my understanding, it's going even faster. And what I foresee is that really we have AID systems and full AID systems. That means also automatic coverage of the insulin requirements after a meal or so, that in a sense patients can forget their disease in the future, which I think is a big step forward. It should not be an excuse to do whatever they like, because then you might go into risky situations, but it's a big help to live normal life. I think this is the goal of all the research, all the development should be.
I totally agree. And I want to take you again back to research, the small talk we had about young people joining the scientific world. I would like you to give one advice to people who would like to be involved in the diabetes field in research, and one of your visions that you would like to share if someone wants to follow a dream of yours or something that you think that is a step that needs to be taken.
So I think for young researchers, of help to have elderly guys like myself, probably as a kind of mentor or something like this. Not normally as a boss or chief, but somebody they can talk to. For example, my own son, he is not working in the diabetes area, at least not directly. He likes to chat with me about ideas and questions, issues he has. For some reasons, I believe I can be of help for him to reflect on topics. Also to make people curious. If they have an idea, a question, you also have to be stubborn, given sense, to follow your ideas, to want to understand what's going on and so on. But this also requires certain engagement. And you always have hurdles, issues, drawbacks. Keep in mind, research is not always bright, and you do not always get the results you would like to have. So you have to follow your ideas for quite a while, but support by people who can be of help is really something I would recommend for young scientists, because otherwise you might get lost somewhere in the space of science.
Thank you. May the future be a collaboration between the experience of older people and the dreams and the energy and the power of younger people. I think that the scientific world needs both. An established collaboration is needed in order to have better outcomes. Always we have to remember that we have to put our egos aside, because the outcome belongs to the world, not to us. I would like you to share, if you have any, story of patient advocacy that has influenced you. Then again, to highlight the importance of people with diabetes speaking for themselves and representing themselves, not only in social media or campaigns, but also in the medical community, in the scientific community. How important is this dialogue between patients and scientists?
Let me start with something very different. Yesterday evening, we had 4 of our grandkids here with us. And one of my granddaughters, she is 6 now, had a friend of her with her. She is a type 1 diabetic, patient with type 1 diabetes. So it was quite interesting to see also my grandkids that then realized, oh, granddad has ideas about diabetes. He was not surprised to have a little girl, 6 years of age, with an insulin pump and a CGM system. Granddad knows something about it. They were really looking at me with different eyes. I smiled a little bit about why should I have talked to them about my professional career before. But it came across that this was an interesting experience for them and for me as well. Coming back to your question about patients and the role of patients, and I think there is a big role for patients. For example, the development of new medical products. I still believe that many of the companies that have very creative ideas, interesting concepts, are lacking the impact of patients and what the patients really need, how to handle the device, and so on. The human factor, and I'm just publishing articles about it, the human factor, the patient influence on the development of products and how to improve them over time. I see a need for many of the companies. So these engineers like myself, the technology is great, but is the device not practically usable in daily life? It's not what the patients are needing. Again, like I tried to indicate before, I think a cooperation is of help there. For example, also in an initiative that is driven by by the Diabetes Center Bern, and we had innovation challenge the other day and on one of the Euros. A number of the developments, interesting concepts and so on. But you ask yourself, how do patients use this in daily life if the device is bulky or too complex or whatever, just as an idea? This is nothing patients will use in daily life. So the optimization of such products also in this respect, I think, is an important aspect where the patient-centric focus of research is sometimes missing.
Health literacy is so important for patients who need to use devices and need equipment and education. Coming next, before closing this session, I would like you to address one of the most pressing challenges in diabetes care today. How do you believe that patients and researchers and scientists can do to solve this issue?
That's a tricky question. For example, probably not so much in the developed countries, but many of the underdeveloped countries, the cost of medical products are an issue, for example. We talked about the benefits of CGM systems, but for somebody in a country where $1 a day is a lot of money, for them, expensive technology is of limited help because they have no access. So to bring down the cost is a key aspect. And again, as a scientist, you always ask, or an engineer, ask for the best technology. However, sometimes for such countries, such application cases, a low-cost version, which would be better, even if it's not the highest quality that you would ask for in a developed country. So approaches that are working for the 50% of patients with type 1 and 80% of the patients with type 2 diabetes in these countries that are affordable. I think this is some challenge that I see where we can also work together in order to help these patients in daily life to live a normal life like we discussed it before. Clearly, I would love to give everybody an AID system, but if this generates, I don't know, a cost of $10 per day, just to give you a number, this is unrealistic. Therefore, something to have for $2 a day, a complete AID system with also the insulin costs and so on. I think this would be a dream, if this was your question, a dream for the future that would be of help for many patients.
Access to healthcare is a human right. When it comes to patients, they should not be divided to elite ones who have the access and affordability to have their equipment and those who were just not lucky enough to be born in a developed country or in a family who can support their medical equipment. I would like to thank you for this session. I really admire your point of view as a person who has dedicated his life to research and is humble enough to understand his contribution, but also to pass the torch to younger generations, but always be there to provide experience and advices to the scientific community. Is there something you would like to add?
No, I wish you good luck with your research, and I hope that I can, for many years, follow what's going on, be of further help to an extent that I can still contribute. And I would like to thank you very much for having me, and hopefully could present you a little bit of what has driven me in my life, in my scientific life. Thank you very much.
Thank